On December 14, 1929, 25-year-old police officer Charles Scally, who went by the name Skelly, was directing traffic at the corner of Broad and State Streets in St. Joseph, Michigan. It was the Christmas shopping season and a busy night for traffic. Perfect conditions for a car accident. At around 8 p.m., a Ford driven by George Kuhl was struck by a drunk driver in a Hudson coupe. Kuhl's fender was damaged, so he approached the driver, demanding restitution. An argument ensued, and the drunk driver got back in his car and fled the scene. Seeing this, Officer Skelly jumped on Kuhl's running board and directed him to follow the drunk driver. When they caught up to the car, Skelly leaped onto the running board of the Hudson and commanded the driver to pull over. The driver pulled out a .45 caliber Colt and fired 3 bullets into Skelly's torso and sped away. Onlookers would rush to Skelly's aid and call for help. He would be taken to a nearby hospital, but his wounds were mortal. Officer Charles Skelly would die that night at 11:10 p.m. During his escape, the drunk driver lost control of his car on Lake Boulevard and smashed into the curb. He climbed out of the car and began running through the side streets of this quiet Michigan town and vanished. Police officers found the wrecked Hudson, and the registration came back to a Mr. Fred Dane from nearby Stevensville, Michigan. When police ascended upon Mr. Dane's home, they were shocked to discover that for the last 10 months, a notorious killer with ties to Al Capone and his Chicago mob had been living in their midst, and soon one of the largest manhunts in the early 20th century would ensue. Today we take a look at notorious gangster Fred Burke, the only person found with physical evidence linked to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So if you're curious, let's take a walk through history. When police arrived at Fred Dane's bungalow, they were greeted by Mrs. Viola Dane, who professed to know nothing of her husband's whereabouts or why he would pull a gun and kill a police officer. But when the police pressed Mrs. Dane for more information about her cop-killer husband, her story began to unravel. Eventually, she was positively identified as underworld character Viola Brenneman. Police searched the bungalow, but they had no idea the significance of what they were about to uncover. They forced open a locked closet and found ammunition, bulletproof vests, revolvers, sawed-off shotguns, hand grenades, dozens of disguises, $390,000 worth of bonds, and 2 Thompson submachine guns. Fingerprints lifted from household items positively identified Fred Dane as Fred Killer Burke, a notorious robber and gunman, close associate of Al Capone, and lead suspect in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre shootings. The Thompson submachine guns were sent to ballistics expert Colonel Calvin Goddard in Chicago. Goddard established through firing pin analysis that both guns had indeed been used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and that one had been used the previous July to kill New York mobster Frankie Yale. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was said to have been arranged by mob boss Al Capone and was considered the gangland crime of the century. Capone and his South Side mob were mortal enemies with Bugs Moran and his Irish gang from Chicago's North Side. Both factions were heavily involved in the procurement and sale of alcohol during the United States Prohibition era, and both sides were vying for total control of those activities in the Chicagoland area. On Valentine's Day, February 14, 1929, a group from the North Side Gang were in a Lincoln Park garage owned by Moran, unloading a shipment of liquor when they were interrupted by local police. The officers held the men at gunpoint and ordered them to line up against a brick wall to be searched. But these officers turned out to be imposters who watched as well-dressed men entered the garage with an array of weapons, including 2 Thompson submachine guns, and killed the men from Moran's gang, as they stood against the wall. Once the gunfire ended, the weapons were handed to the police imposters, who then acted as if they were arresting the gunmen and escorted them out of the garage to a waiting phony police car. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was complete. There are several theories as to who masterminded the hit that day, from crooked cops who had a stake in the bootleg industry to other local mob groups, such as the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. But the fact that 2 of the murder weapons were found in the possession of Burke, a known gunman for Capone, seemed to end speculation. The massacre was a carefully crafted assault aimed at eliminating Moran. Capone had to be cautious not to involve his Chicago-based mob in the hit. If anything should go wrong or any of his own gang get captured, the implications of Capone being responsible would be devastating. So Capone reached out to a group of expert hitmen from St. Louis, Missouri, known as the American Boys, a group that Fred Burke was firmly entrenched in. The American Boys were loyal to Capone and were happy to perform the hit, but they had no idea what Moran looked like in person. When the shots rang out, the American Boys assumed Moran was one of the men they had standing against the wall. But Moran wasn't at the garage. He was running late that day and was a few blocks away. Although Bugs Moran didn't lose his life during the massacre, the hit was essentially successful. Moran's grip on Chicagoland soon waned, and Al Capone solidified himself as the head of Chicago's underworld. A number of men were suspected of being involved in the crime. There were even eyewitnesses who placed Burke at the garage during the assault, but there was insufficient evidence to bring anyone up on charges. Each mobster who was detained and questioned about the crime was eventually set free. But all that seemed to change once the ballistics confirmed the weapons in Burke's possession were used at the massacre. Fred Burke was now public enemy number 1, and a nationwide manhunt was underway. Law enforcement throughout Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois were notified, and rewards over $100,000 for Burke's apprehension were offered. But Burke was nowhere to be found. While he had a long history of run-ins with the law, he had an even longer history of aliases and blending in with society. A little more than a year passed with no leads on Burke's whereabouts. Then a break in the case arrived out of the blue. On March 26, 1931, a Missouri man recognized Burke after seeing his picture in True Detective magazine. Burke had moved to St. Joseph, Missouri, assumed the alias of Richard White, and married a woman named Bonnie Porter. You know, it seems to me that the towns named St. Joseph, both in Michigan and Missouri, didn't serve Burke very well. 4 St. Joseph police officers and a local sheriff entered the small farmhouse where Burke was staying on his father-in-law's property. Burke was sleeping in a back bedroom and was awakened by the intrusion. He tried to reach for his .38 caliber revolver, but officers overpowered him and placed him in custody. Not a single shot was fired. He was taken to Buchanan County Jail in St. Joseph, where authorities announced that they had indeed captured public enemy number 1, Fred Killer Burke. But the authorities faced a dilemma. Should Burke be sent to Illinois for the prosecution in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, or should he be extradited to Michigan for the murder of Officer Jack Skelly? Well, even with the ballistics evidence and the eyewitness accounts placing Burke at the garage the day of the massacre, the Illinois District Attorney didn't feel he had enough evidence to gain a conviction. Also, for some reason, Michigan was the only state to have made the extradition application formally, as the Illinois application had been withdrawn. Missouri Governor Henry Caulfield had no choice but to send Burke to Michigan. On April 27, 1931, Burke pled guilty to the second-degree murder of Officer Charles Skelly and was sentenced to life in prison at the Marquette State Penitentiary. The life sentence would amount to only 9 years. On July 10, 1940, 47-year-old Fred Killer Burke died in his sleep of a heart attack. Even though police found the weapons in his bungalow, he never admitted to any involvement in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Fred Burke is buried at the Marquette State Penitentiary under his real name, Thomas A. Camp. it seems his long run of aliases finally ran out. Thank you for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time as we explore more curious history. Take care.